But you know my biases. I absolutely love IPA, especially IPA that comes in giant cans. I'm good with hop water. To have this beer that doesn't have a big, rich malt base, that doesn't have a strong, firm like malt backbone and presence, that it's just like, no, it's hops, it's 3% alcohol, comes in a giant can, it's Canada Day. Happy Canada Day, by the way. And it's just light and fresh and friendly, and it's got lots of hop character. I'm totally good with that. It's also a lighter color, Craig. You're quite right. It is a little bit cloudy and hazy, but it's also a very, very light color. I really like these session ales. I'm glad they've started coming around. Now, I am going to step away just for a second here because we're about to dive deep into the British brewing industry here and talk a little bit about British brewing in a style that we're not tasting, because there isn't actually a good one like this in Alberta that I've seen so far. And that's a style called Golden Ale. When we're talking about the low alcohol British styles, we're going to taste mild and we are going to taste bitter. And we're going to taste something that kind of sits somewhere in the middle. But there is Golden Ale, and Golden Ales are very, very much like this. We had a brewery that we had come in, and I've spent the better part of the afternoon racking my brain to remember what the heck it was called. But it came in glass bottles, it was from the UK, and it had names like Summer Lightning and just beautiful, beautiful beers. And they were very, very low alcohol, and they were really, really hop forward, and they were very classic, and they were very much like this. They didn't last worth a damn. They were off within 90 days, which is I think why they didn't come back. But they're very, very pretty golden ales, and I think the term golden ale, at least in North America, has very much been supplanted by the idea of even SYC does a golden ale that's just, I don't know, it's pale lager that happens to be fermented with ale yeast, and that's really mean to the beer, but I happen to not like it, so I'm going to be as mean to it as I want. The idea of this very, very light, low alcohol beer that's very sessionable but has some hop character, I think isn't by any means a North American invention, but calling it a session ale or an India session ale, I think absolutely is. I also think this marks the occasion of us now having tasted every single Blind Men beer we sell, which was going to happen sooner. I mean, it doesn't mean like the singles, but like everything in 4-packs, we now have officially made through all of it. And yeah, you're right. That is an interesting thing on the back of your cans here. Sales of the beer actually support CKUA. And for those of you who don't know, if you haven't been coming into the store of recent or in the last 5 years, unless they're playing something completely insane, which because it's CKUA does occasionally happen, we generally have CKUA on in the store because it's a station I really support. So yeah, we've started seeing the summer session stories starting to show up on CKUA, which has been a fun little feature. So yeah. Made by Blind Men, supports CKUA, really neat, kind of light, fresh, pretty beer. Nice, good place to start. And 3% alcohol. You really can't argue with that. We actually just got, on Friday, so unfortunately too late for the beer tasting this week, we actually got a new beer from Dunham called their Dilettante, which is very much like this, out of Quebec actually, salt in single cans. And that's very, very nice as well. I don't know if it's more carbonated, Chad, or less carbonated than anything else. I think it just might be the fact that the beer doesn't have any viscosity. Alcohol is a little more viscous than water, and that richer, thicker thing in the beer actually will force the carbonation to stay in better. Part of the reason that carbonation in beer and carbonation in like Coca-Cola feels different, and you can even test this where if you just have like a Coke versus a rum and Coke, adding the alcohol actually increases the viscosity of the beverage and actually will slow down how much the carbonation comes off and will actually change the carbonation of the beverage. I really find this when I get into like barley wines or high alcohol imperial stouts, you'll actually notice that the carbonation comes off really, really slowly, almost more like a champagne. It's not as fine as a champagne by any means. Also, Aaron's having a hamburger and the smell is absolutely killing me because it smells great. And yeah, Dunham's really good. But yeah, we saw beers like this kind of start coming out in fits and starts about 5-8 years ago. And they did quite well for us. They didn't do well enough to ever come back, apparently, province-wide, but they did well for us. But yeah, I love this style. I just wish we saw a little bit more of it. Now, speaking of style that I wish I saw more of, this American mild. This is a particular style of mild. I'm going to touch on American first, and then we'll come back to the long, proud history of mild ales in the UK, mostly because I'm not done my super session yet. I was first introduced to an American mild in a style called a Portugal ale. Now, Portugal ales are also known as second runnings beers. So effectively, you make a big, high gravity, high alcohol imperial stout or barley wine or a giant double IPA, and you've got your mash, and you either don't sparge it. So after you've mashed all the beer in and you've poured it over to clarify the beer, you just run off the liquid. Now that's going to leave a ton of sugar still in that big barley mash. Now normally you do what's called a sparge, and as you draw off liquid, you would pump hot water on top of it to just pull all that sugar out so you get more liquid out of your grain. But if you don't do that, if you just stop it after a natural float, and then you take that liquid away and you bring in a new vessel, and then you run it through again to get a lower alcohol beer, and then you can even do that again with a sparge to get a third beer. That's known as Portugal brewing. It's basically many beers from one. And milds in many cases are second or even third runnings beers that have very, very low cost. I was introduced to this beer sitting at the Tamarack Brewing Company, which is Lanny McDonald's brewing company in Lakeside, Montana, down on Flathead Lake. And I had gone out the night before with my friend Adam, who did our sour beer tasting with us. And we had gotten ourselves absolutely destroyed at about 7 different breweries, and it was a wonderful evening. And so we went out the next morning, and we went out for the giant Huevos Rancheros at Tamarack because it's seriously like so big. And then we got wings because the Huevos Rancheros was taking a minute. But they had the mild ale on that day, and they called it Wild Mild. When we could still get Tamarack, I begged them to bring Wild Mild to Alberta because I said it by like 10 flats. They never did, tragically. But it was a second runnings brew of the Old Stash Porter, which is kind of their prestige beer there. They do a whiskey barrel-aged version as well. And basically, they were selling them for, I want to say like $1.75 a pint for the mild. So we just sat there. The beer was 2.75% alcohol, and we just sat there nursing our beers, nursing our hangovers, and waiting for our Huevos Rancheros that took the better part of an hour. This American mild, I love this beer. Like, you know, we bring in these beers and they tend to be like $16.95, $17.95, $18.95, a 4-pack. I think we're selling this for the princely sum of $8.95 for 4 tall cans, which is just madness. And to me, that says this has to be a Portugal beer because they're basically making it with waste from making a different beer. Because if they're not, I don't know how they're doing this at this price. Like, it's just madness how cheap this is. So let's crack open our American mild. You know, the natural beer for Canada Day. This is a Canadian beer, by the way. It's brewed in Calgary. But you know. So yeah, darker obviously, so perhaps the second runnings beer. But mild's an interesting style. I always say to people, I don't know if I want a mild. You know, it sounds like it's just gonna be boring. It's gonna sound like, compared to how many high flavored beers we have there, like we got big powerful stouts that are very, very rich and sweet and toasty. We got IPAs that are so bitter. We've got sours. We got fruit ales. We've got all these crazy flavors. It's like, why do I want like a mild? That's like, you know, oh wow, I don't want like a good steak. I'll just have like, you know, Salisbury steak. I don't want anything too exciting. But milds aren't that. Milds are super, super fun, interesting, offbeat styles that are starting to become cool again. Mild was the predominant beer style in the UK before the rise of pale ales and bitters. So if you're around for our pale ale tasting, we talked about the invention of Coke being a very clean burning fuel that allowed them to make dried malted barley that was actually very pale in color and would give you kind of a clean, fresh, like nippy taste. Before that, mild was basically universal. And to have a mild was kind of the thing to do. It was the most popular beer style in the UK for a very, very long time. And as the industrialization of the UK kind of went away, so did mild drinking. I've seen it variously described as a very cloth cap sort of beer. It's a blue color working man's beer. Like, you don't go into a bar and order an IPA or a bitter or a stout like some fancy gentleman named Trevor or something. You drink a mild because it was, what your dad drank, and it had a real like positive position. Mild almost went extinct in the 1980s. It was down to 1.6% of the British actual drinking. It was almost completely wiped out by bitter. And when the campaign for Real Ale, or CAMRA, came in, they really started promoting milds as being part of their heritage. They actually kept giving, like, I think for the first 10 years of CAMRA's best beer in Britain, I think a mild one, like 8 years out of 10. I don't want to say their judging was slanted, but they may have had a slight agenda on that. And then Americans picked it up as a nice way to bring people in the door for like a cheap pint. Like if an average beer in the U.S. is $5, they would be putting these on for like $1.50, $1.75 for like a full pint. The alcohol's lower, sure, but they're full of flavor. And the American mild industry, it's very often these Partagal beers, these second runnings beers. They don't brew it as its own separate beer. They start out with something big and powerful and challenging that's going to get all the high ratings on Beer Advocate and Rate Beer, and then they just use all that really expensive malted barley that they use to make the beer, and they just add a little more grain, or they run the water through again, and you end up with something very, very flavorful and cheap. I love mild for that. Any idea how many calories in the supersaturation are in there? I have a very interesting answer, actually. No. Back to the milds. One of the fun things I learned about mild, I actually did a lot of research for this one. One of the really, really fun things I discovered is that milds traditionally were actually sold on an X scale. So if you've ever seen like Tooheys 4X out of Australia, or even just down like old Tom and Jerry cartoons where like they've got these big jugs with X's written on them, that was actually a way of declaring the alcohol in milds. With bitters, it's by name, so your low alcohol bitters are ordinary bitters, and then into best bitters, and then finally into extra special bitters at the highest alcohol level. With milds, it was all by X's, so you'd have a 1X to a 4X depending on the alcohol. So the idea of like buying a can of beer that just has X's on it to tell you it's real strong. Well, in milds case, real strong was like higher than 5%. So it wasn't the strongest thing in the world, but yeah, that's part of where our idea of like strong liquors coming with 4 X's on them come from, is actually how they declared bitters, how they declared mild ales right up to the 1980s. It carries forward to these days, not so much as an actual system, but you'll still see like, John Smith's triple X mild ale. It's a 3 out of 4 strength mild. It's a really interesting system that's still going on today. Now, this is not a very particularly British style of mild. It's far too hoppy. It's far too kind of up in your face. But for $8.95 a 4-pack, for something that you could literally buy for, I want to say like Lucky prices, that's a heck of a lot better than a Lucky, I'll say that. The other nice thing I'll say for OT, especially compared to the Blind Man, they've kept the carbonation soft. All of the latter 3 beers here, the OT American Mild, the 180, and the Endeavour ESB, these are beers that are traditionally will be pulled through a beer engine or a hand pump. It's a misnomer to say that British people like their beer warm. They like it warmer than North Americans do, but it's what we would normally call cellar temperature, about 12 to 14 degrees centigrade. It's cool but not ice cold, and part of the reason for that is they don't use corn, which turns sour when it gets warm. So you can't drink a Coors Light at cellar temperature because it tastes aggressively sour because they use so much corn in it. But with these, it allows some of those sweeter malts, like the chocolate malt that Craig brought up. Anyways, Triple X Mild is very Bugs Bunny, and it's exactly my point. Like, that's where that comes from, is the mild industry of like this late 1700s through the Second World War sort of thing. So yeah. I could actually smell this all day. This is by far the cheapest thing on the table. It's about half the price of anything else we've got. And I'm just all about this beer. One of the really interesting things about mild is mild actually took a downgrade in terms of alcohol about the First World War. So mild was always a very gentle, like sessionable. You can sit down, have 3 or 4, and you're not driving home necessarily, but you're not, all off your bar stool and laying on the bar or the floor either. It's a fairly sessionable beer. But during the First World War in the UK, milds were, because they required very little barley, they were the most profitable beers for the breweries. And so they got taxed very, very, very heavily. And so that mild ales basically became unprofitable to brew. The lesser known styles, the higher alcohol styles, weren't taxed anywhere near as heavily. So those actually ended up becoming the profit drivers for the breweries in the UK. So as a result, the mild ales, they started pulling barley away from the milds. So mild went from kind of an average alcohol of about 3.6 to 4.2, all the way down to about 2.5% alcohol. And people actually got a taste for these very, very gentle, low alcohol milds. And so they actually continued staying around that 2.5, 3% alcohol. And only recently they started coming back up, largely because of American mild styles. So basically these breweries were saying, oh, well, we're not making anything on our big cellar. Let's just take the barley we would normally put in that. We'll pay all the taxes on this stuff, but at 2.5% alcohol, it doesn't cost anything to make anyway. And we'll put it into the stuff we're not being taxed on. And there was actually the idea that mild ale was the beer that you just kind of dumped whatever in and really just said, that was part of what ruined mild ale in the UK in terms of sales. Like before World War I, mild ale was just it. It was like if you went out here and you went to a bad bar that only had like pale lagers on tap, and then there was a war and you came back and all they had was like stout. That was really the difference with mild. The taxing really did kill mild because it wasn't really applied to bitter or stout or porter or pale ale or India pale ales or anything else. It was specifically on mild, which really drove mild into being not only kind of perceived as a blue-collar beer, but also as being perceived as one of lower quality. And it became a self-fulfilling prophecy because they had no money to spend on ingredients because the taxes were so high, so they had to make it cheaper. Happily, we have beers like this again. Is the mild heavy and thick like a stout? No, it can't be because it's only 4.3% alcohol. It's certainly heavier than the Blind Man because the Blind Man is effectively, I'm not going to use this as a dismissive or mean term, it's very much a hop water. It's got some alcohol, it's got some body, but really and truly it's all about the hops. The American Mild is thick and it's chewy and it's got some interesting things going on. But compared to like a St. Amboise Oatmeal Stout, or especially compared to like something bigger like the Blind Man Trip Hammer Porter, it's not nearly as big or as viscous or as thick as that, largely because the alcohol isn't high enough to be able to do that. Let's move our merry way right along and get into the 180. Now they call this an English pub ale. Now, it doesn't call itself a mild, doesn't call itself a bitter, it calls itself a pub ale. Now, what is a pub ale? Well, that's a very interesting question. So, bitters grew out of milds. With the invention of being able to make a paler malt because of the invention of Coke and being able to make these pale ales very quickly grew into bitter. Now, it wasn't called bitter because bitter was intensely bitter. Like compared to an India Pale Ale, bitter has almost no like perceivable bitterness, especially to a incredibly jaded IPA drinker like myself. I don't pick up the bitterness at all. But it was more bitter than mild because it was a hop-focused style. OT actually does go to the time to actually properly Burtonize this. So they're basically taking Calgary water, stripping it down to completely neutral, and then adding salts and pH to bring the beer up to exactly the same style of water that you would get in Burton-on-Trent. So they're going for a very traditional English style. Now, in English pub ale, I discovered a style that I'd actually never heard of before. So when mild was slowly kind of transforming in some ways into bitter, there was actually a style that kind of grew up in between the two that was known as an AK. All my searching actually did not come up with what AK stood for, but it kind of stood right in the middle. It wasn't a mild, it wasn't a bitter, it was somewhere in the middle. So a bitter would be a pale, hop-focused beer, and when I say hop-focused, I mean hop-focused in the sense of 200 to 300 years ago when, all hops were imported and we were still having a fight in the UK about the fact that ale, and this is absolutely true, ale was defined as a beer that didn't have any hops, whereas a beer had actual hops imported from France because there was no East Kent Goldings. There was nothing grown for hops in the UK. They had to use expensive imported hops to make beer. That was a real delineation. So AKs, which is roughly what I would call this, kind of fit right in that middle between a mild and between a true bitter. So let's give this a try. Ooh, that's very soft. The carbonation is even softer than the mild, very biscuity. The carbonation kind of sits on your tongue and lingers. I get the hops, but they're not coming off like the Blind Men. They're not coming off as aggressively citric, and they're not coming off as piney. They're coming off a little more cheesy and woodsy and kind of grassy. They're very, very traditionally British hops. They're very elegant, very laid back. I can see why they're going with the term English pub ale, because if I tasted this and you said it was a bitter, I'd say, okay, well, it needs a little more hop profile. If you called it a mild, I'd say, I want it a little darker. I kind of like this right in the middle, and I think that's exactly where it belongs. I'm glad everybody's really grooving on this, or at least Craig, Deirdre, and Kevin are grooving on this, because I've wanted to do this event for a while, because I can only talk so much about New England pales and sours and pilsners, and those aren't the only three styles out there, and it's not exactly stout weather. I don't really want to be doing, hey, it's August 4th and it's 35 degrees outside, and we're all going to sit here on a Wednesday night and drink 11.5% Imperial Stouts. I mean, it'd be funny, but it wouldn't be a lot of fun, especially Thursday morning. So I'm really glad we actually got to do this little event, so I really, really like this 180. Now, mild grew into bitter, of course, but these AK styles, these kind of central styles, this very much is, having been to the UK and actually sat in a pub with a beer engine a few times, this is very much what I'm used to being served. The carbonation is gentle. There's a lot of flavor, but it's not sharp. There's not a lot of hop bitterness. There's no aggressive sourness. There's none of that. Ooh, Lorraine, apricots. Yeah, apricots is absolutely spot on. I like that. Haven't heard about this brewery before. Okay, OT I really, really, really like. The problem with OT, and they're based in Calgary, they got started with the worst packaging known to man. They apparently, again, this is just off me, but they apparently heard that 4-packs were going to be the new cool style. So they did 4-packs of small 330s, and they had bright silver cans with silver labels, and they ended up being super anonymous and basically disappearing on the shelf. And by the time they kind of got their packaging sorted out and switched to tall cans and switched to good labels, some of the buzz around them had kind of died off. They do really, really great work, and I respect the hell out of them, but very often, they're one of our slowest moving breweries, which is part of why I wanted to do a couple of their beers. Their Black Line Wit, it was trouble to sell. Their Flagstick Pale, which I think is the best American pale in Alberta, I brought it on 3 separate occasions, and I cannot give it away. These guys make the 500 IPA, which is an outstanding IPA, and it sells very, very well when I can get it. But they're just one of those breweries that just, great brewing, great ideas, great everything, just kind of done in by their packaging, I feel like, which is a real shame, because we've been trying to push this brewery since the very beginning. Oh, it is about darts. Thank you. I didn't realize that until you said it, Craig. But yeah, this is about darts. The name refers to darts. Okay, that does make sense. Gonna be 3 trip 20s. So now I'm going to do a little review here with the bitters. So bitters, of course, came out of pale ales. Pale ales came out of the invention of Coke and the invention of pale, dried, clean burning malt that didn't taste smoky or woody or any of that. And then within bitters themselves, they had ordinary, best, and special bitter or extra special bitter, or ESB. These tend to be the highest alcohol one. They tend to be the prettiest and also very steely. I consider the reference beer for ESBs being the Fuller's ESB. It's just one of those classic beers that you really, I don't know, I couldn't do without. I think it's one of those just reference beers that you have to have. If you're going to taste bitters, you have to have Fuller's. It's also a huge brand, and I'm sure everyone at Cameron would be like, no, Fuller's is terrible. You have to drink like this super cool beer from Yorkshire, and it's better. And it's like, no, I can't get that here. But I do really respect that local brewers are starting to pick up the slack and do some ESBs. Daryl over at Spectrum Brewing in town here, he makes an absolutely killer ESB. He actually is the one who recommended the Endeavor ESB. No, I like good bitters. Wild Rose, this is one thing I actually wish they were still doing. Wild Rose, they called it SOB because they thought they were being cute. But they made an absolutely exceptional bitter. It was good out of bottle. It was great on tap. It was phenomenal out of cask. I wish Wild Rose was still making that bitter because that was good bitter. Alcohol content on the 180 is a whopping 4.6. And the Express ESB is 5.4. Now, I owe Endeavor a little bit of an apology on this one. I've been telling people that 5.4 is too much alcohol for a bitter. It's not a real bitter. It's North Americanized. I was wrong. For a ordinary bitter or a best bitter, yes, anything over 5 would be wildly inappropriate. Actually, anything over about 4.5 for either of those styles would be wildly inappropriate. ESB is an export style for the most part. It's not really designed for local consumption so much. This was very much the style that they would make and then not ship overseas, but if you were a famous brewery in, say, the north of England and people wanted to drink your beer in the south, well, a beer at 2.8 that's not really hopped aggressively, it's not going to make the trip, not by wagon, not by steam engine or anything. It's just not. Until modern refrigeration and everything, like the idea of taking a beer at that super low alcohol and low hopping level and shipping it around the world was madness. It's still kind of madness. So ESBs were more designed to be exported, not country to country, but certainly town to town. And something between 5 and 6 for an ESB is appropriate. And Craig, I'm right there with you. I can't remember the last time I found a good best bitter. And Jeremy, I'm glad I'm not the only one who remembers Wild Rose SOB. It was a good beer. Now, bitter scares people, and I find this really unfortunate about the name. Like, I don't know. When I think bitter, and again, IPA's changed so much in the last 8 years, but when I think bitter, I don't think like English bitters. I think like, you know, super old-fashioned like West Coast IPAs. I would have to think, and correct me if I'm wrong out there, people who've done all of these, but is the most bitter thing we've done in 12 weeks the Phillips Pandemonium? Like in terms of actual like perceivable bitterness? I've got to think it's either that or maybe 88 Wave Pool. Like bitters are not that bitter. They're more bitter than milds. And that was the whole idea, is they wanted to come up with an idea because when you went into a bar, and this is English-British history, this is going back far enough where the idea of having like placards or signs on all the taps as to what they were, that wasn't like a thing yet. You'd go into the bar and there'd be 3 handles and you have to ask the bartender what they were, and if the bar was busy, the bartender wasn't going to tell you. He was just going to be like, no, I've got people who will just give me money and they don't need an explanation. Traditionally, there'd be bitter, mild, and either pale or golden, or if we were a little later on in history, post about 1805-ish, you'd have porter or stout as the third option. So bitter really came about as a shorthand for pale ale. So you'd have the mild, which at that point in history was what 90% of the bar would be drinking. But bitter kind of came about as a more reliable style. Mild could be anything from like almost water clear right up to just a stout at lower alcohol. It could be hoppy, it could be completely soft. Bitter tended to be a little more consistent because they were all aiming for that newer, more modern style out of Burton-on-Trent. They're all broadly pale ales. They all broadly had the same kind of hoppy backbone and then a nice malt sweetness. And bitter grew. Bitter overtook mild, certainly by the turn of the 20th century. And it became kind of a phenomenon, which carries forward to this day. You can still get lager, like by the pint in British pubs. Absolutely you can. It's probably more popular than bitter these days. But bitter, and to a lesser extent mild, still holds strong with a huge population. Bitter more in the more affluent areas of the UK. Mild tends to still have this working class blue collar thing going on. So the West Midlands and the north of England into southern Scotland, you tend to see more milds. Whereas in like London, it's bitter for days. And I have no idea where I'm going to get my order on this. Wow, how do you order this? One? Maybe? And after that, I'm a bit lost. Two... No. One and then all about the same. I love the mild. These are, to me, all excellent beers, but just too different to really rank against each other. Like, the American mild wins for me. Happy Canada Day. But, you know, I really, really like them all, but the mild to me wins it. Oh, and yes, all the lager in the UK does tend to be either Peroni or... is it Kronenberg that you see all the time? I see Peroni bloody everywhere. The other one in Scotland more so, it's McEwen's Lager. When I was last in Scotland, like, I could go from anywhere from the Edinburgh airport to like the dankest bar on Islay to the most fancy place around, and you just get McEwen's Lager. And it's a terrible lager, by the way. I apologize if you like it. You're a bad person. But no, McEwen's Lager is just bloody everywhere. Oh, Stella. Yeah, Stella is absolutely everywhere. 3142. Chad, you hurt me. And Heather as well. That's all right. I can live with it. So, questions, comments? Let's talk. Oh, we just jumped right through the shameless promotion portion. So let's talk about what we got coming up next time, because next time I'm actually rather pleased with myself for this one. I mean, if you've met me, when am I not pleased with myself? But, you know, this time in particular, that got a laugh out, Aaron. This time in particular, I'm quite pleased with this one. This is going to be fun. So we are going to do a real and proper fruit week. We've danced around fruit beer. We have talked about it off and on for quite some time. And I wanted to do one where we actually just said, no, this is fruit week. And because I'm a contrarian, we have one beer that actually doesn't contain any fruit at all. So we're going to do the Establishment Superfusion, which, based on the way it's selling so far, is actually going to be sold out apart from the beer tasting kits by this time next week. So this is a Katharina Sour with pink guava. Then we have the Relic, which is a Tangerine Goza by Zero Issue, a brewery that we really should taste more of because they do great work, but I can't get a hold of them to do a beer tasting with us. If you're watching this and you work for Zero Issue, give me a call because you guys make great stuff. And then Pineapple FOMO, a beer that could either have been deeply ironic for the fact it means fear of missing out, and if it was an unpopular beer, no one would be missing out on it. But in reality, like, this stuff sells itself. It's absolute magic. It's fascinating, wonderful, like pineapple upside down, cakey pineapple sour. Absolutely love it. And then the beer that kind of inspired this, the Dagger Jumo. This is actually a beer that contains no oranges. They advertise it right on the front label. Tart Kveik fermented ale containing no oranges, and yet it tastes exactly like oranges. And they do that through some really, really clever work with the Kveik yeast, and then use Mandarina, Bavaria, and Citra hops to create this like super upfront orange character. So we're doing basically tangerine, pineapple, guava, and not orange for our fruit beer tasting, and I'm really excited for it. So that's coming up next week, Wednesday, for the beer tasting. For wine tasting this Friday, it's a little bit of a patio party sort of thing. We just wanted to have a little bit of fun. So we've got, assuming, the technology works out, Aaron, we have both Andrew Stewart of Vino El Vino and Eric Mercier of Juice Imports joining us for this one. So our best-selling, not just wine, not just our best-selling item in the entire store, including cases of beer, kegs, Mickeys of vodka, whatever. The best-selling thing we sold last year was Brock Seller's Love Red, and we haven't had it on the channel yet, and it's an embarrassment because we haven't, because they're not cheap. Chris Brockway's wines kind of run from like $30 up to like $80. I was at the winery this last summer. They make spectacular stuff. I'm doing the red and the rosé. I would have loved to have done the white as well, but it's unfortunately sold out. So we're going to do something a little bit different for a white. We're going to dip into the Italian pool here. It's Italian, it's white, it's Moscato, it's sparkling, which means it's going to be really sweet, except it's not. This is actually a bone-dry Italian Moscato. It's a stupid, stupid kind of genius, and I really, really love it. This is just designed to be light, fresh, kind of patio fun, but a really, really, really high level. I know I don't like doing 3 wine tastings for the Friday night because they look like they're bad value. We're not making a ton on this one because the Love Sellers wines are expensive as it starts, and these aren't cheap either. So these are really, really interesting tastings. So we've got that coming up Friday as well. Put these back up on the wall in entirely the wrong order because Devin's going to yell at me in the morning. And yeah. Oh, I love the excitement for Fruit Week. Fruit Week's going to be good, yeah. I'm really stoked for it too. 2341 4321. Barry, thank you. 2134. You're a good sort, Barry. I like you. Yeah. I think that's all the points I wanted to cover tonight. So wow, we raced through that pretty quick, Aaron. What is it? Oh yeah, it's not even 1:45 yet. Any last questions from anybody before we wrap this thing up? No? Not quite? All right. Well, we'll call it at 45 minutes. You folks get out there, enjoy your Canada Day, grill something, set off some illegal fireworks. If the AGLC is watching, I did not say set off illegal fireworks. I said steamed hams. So, yeah. In the meantime, I'm Kyle from Andrew Hilton Wine and Spirits. Probably got myself in a whole lot of trouble for that comment, but we'll sort that out tomorrow because today's a holiday and hopefully the liquor inspectors aren't working. You folks enjoy your day off. Have a wonderful night. Cheers.